She told her mother she would be back by 6 o'clock that evening. She kissed her on the cheek, grabbed her jacket from the hook by the front door, and walked out into the afternoon sun with a smile on her face. She was 17 years old. She was full of life. She had plans for college. She had a laugh that people said could fill up a whole room. And she trusted the girl sitting in the passenger seat of that car more than almost anyone on earth. They had grown up together. They had shared secrets, shared bedrooms on sleepovers, shared tears after heartbreaks. That girl in the car was not just her friend. She was her best friend. And that is exactly what made what happened next so devastating, so calculated, and so utterly impossible to believe. Because that girl, the one she trusted with everything, had already decided that she was never coming home. 3 days later, hikers found her body face down in a shallow creek, deep in the woods, far from any road. A 100-pound log had been placed across her back to hold her under the water. Her long hair had been cut off. And for 3 years, the person who put her there stood in her mother's kitchen, cried at her memorial, helped organize the search parties, and told anyone who would listen that she wanted justice for her best friend. This is the story of Melissa Carter. And the girl who killed her was the one person nobody ever suspected. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because what you just heard is not fiction. This is not a movie. Every detail of what I am about to tell you is drawn from real documented court records, witness testimony, and police investigation files. And what those records reveal is something far more disturbing than most people are willing to believe, not because of how brutal the crime was, but because of how ordinary everything looked right up until the moment it wasn't. People talk a lot about the dangers that come from strangers. We warn our children about people they don't know. We lock our doors at night against threats we imagine coming from the outside. But the evidence in this case, and in more cases than most of us would like to admit, tells a very different story. The evidence in this case says that the most dangerous person in Melissa Carter's life was someone who called her by her nickname, someone who knew where she kept her diary, someone who had a key to her house. So today, we are going to walk through this entire story from the beginning. And I want you to pay very close attention as we do, because this story is full of moments that, in hindsight, were warning signs. Moments where something felt slightly off, slightly wrong, slightly too convenient. And I want you to ask yourself as we go, would you have seen them? Because the people closest to Melissa didn't. Not her mother, not her brothers, not the detectives who first worked the case. Nobody saw it. And that's not because they weren't smart enough. It's because the person responsible for Melissa's death was extraordinarily good at pretending to be something she wasn't. Her name was Karen Mitchell. She and Melissa had been best friends since the 3rd grade. They grew up 3 blocks apart in a quiet suburb outside of Los Angeles, California, in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. They were, by every account, inseparable. Karen was at Melissa's 8th birthday party. Melissa was the first person Karen called when her parents announced they were getting divorced. They shared clothes. They shared playlists. They shared the kind of easy, unspoken understanding that only comes from years of genuine closeness. But by the time they were teenagers, something had shifted. Something quiet and invisible and deeply corrosive had grown up inside Karen Mitchell, and it had a name. The name was jealousy. Not the passing, harmless kind that comes and goes and gets laughed off. This was the slow, festering kind. The kind that starts small, a sideways glance at someone's new shoes, a tightening in the chest when someone gets more attention at a party, and grows over time into something that poisons every good thing around it. Because while Karen struggled in school, Melissa had begun to thrive. While Karen felt increasingly invisible, Melissa was becoming one of the most well-liked girls in their grade. She was warm. She was funny. She was the kind of person that people were naturally drawn to, not because she tried to stand out, but because she was genuinely kind. And the boys noticed her. One boy in particular noticed her, and that is where the real trouble began. His name was Ryan. He was the kind of boy that every teenage girl in that school seemed to have a complicated relationship with. Charming, a little reckless, always laughing. Karen had been dating Ryan for several months. Or at least, she thought she had been dating Ryan. The truth, as it so often is in stories like this, was somewhat more complicated. Ryan had briefly dated Melissa before Karen, and it had ended with Melissa walking away. Not dramatically, not cruelly. She simply told him they wanted different things and moved on. By all accounts, Melissa had no lingering feelings for Ryan whatsoever. But Karen didn't see it that way. In Karen's mind, Melissa had something that should have been hers. And then, when Ryan told Karen that he had tried to get back together with Melissa and she had turned him down again, Karen's feelings about her best friend changed completely. Now, I want to be precise here, because this is important. There was no affair. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was nothing, from Melissa's perspective, to even suggest that anything was wrong. She still called Karen her best friend. She still included her in everything. She still had no idea that the girl sitting across from her at lunch, the girl she had known since childhood, had begun to think about her in ways that were deeply troubling. And that is perhaps the most chilling part of this whole story, the fact that Melissa never saw it coming. Not even close. There was a second girl involved. Her name was Laura Simmons. Laura had her own reasons for resenting Melissa, though hers were somewhat different from Karen's. Laura had dated a boy named Victor, and she believed, correctly, it turned out, that Melissa had been spending time with Victor behind her back. Whether it was as serious as Laura believed is something that was never fully established. But the belief itself was enough. The belief lit a fire in Laura that had been quietly smoldering for months. What investigators would eventually piece together, years later, was that Karen and Laura had both arrived at the same dark place from different directions. Two girls, carrying two separate grievances, who found each other and discovered that together, their resentment had a direction it couldn't find alone. And so, they began to plan. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, methodically, in the way that only people with a great deal of patience and a great deal of hate can do. They planned what they were going to do to Melissa Carter. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, as we get into the details of what happened on October 1st of that year, I need you to understand something about the world Melissa was living in. She wasn't naive. She wasn't careless. She was a 17-year-old girl in a quiet neighborhood who had known her best friend for 9 years and had absolutely no reason to believe that anything had changed between them. And that is the detail that stays with you long after you've finished listening to this story. It's not the horror of what happened in those woods. It's the 9 years. It's the birthday parties and the sleepovers and the shared secrets. It's the way that something that looked exactly like love could secretly be something else entirely. That is what this story is really about. The morning of that Tuesday started the way most school days did for Melissa. She got up, she got ready, she had breakfast with her mother. Her mother later told investigators that Melissa seemed completely normal that day, happy, even relaxed. She said Melissa had been looking forward to the afternoon because she was going to spend it with Laura, who had recently gotten her license and had offered to take Melissa out for a drive. It was just supposed to be a regular afternoon between friends. The kind of thing Melissa had done dozens of times before. Her mother kissed her goodbye, watched her walk down the front steps, and thought nothing of it. She expected her daughter home by dinner. She expected to hear about the drive, hear about whatever they had talked about, maybe help Melissa with her homework. She expected an ordinary evening. She did not know that she would never see her daughter alive again. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Laura Simmons arrived at Melissa's house in her car. Karen Mitchell was already in the back seat. Melissa climbed in. According to court records and witness testimony gathered over the course of a very long investigation, Melissa was in high spirits during the drive. She was laughing, talking, completely at ease with the two girls she considered to be among her closest friends. They drove out toward the hills. They told Melissa they wanted to go somewhere quiet, somewhere they could walk around and talk. Melissa agreed. Why wouldn't she? These were her people. This was her best friend. They parked near the entrance to a hiking trail that wound back into a wooded area along the edge of a canyon. It was a beautiful afternoon. The light was coming through the trees in long golden shafts, the way it does in October in Southern California when the air starts to cool just slightly at the edges. The three girls got out of the car and started walking into the woods. And as they walked, something in the atmosphere shifted. The conversation began to change. The laughter faded. And Melissa, who was a perceptive girl by all accounts, began to feel, for the first time that afternoon, that something was wrong. She didn't know what it was yet. She couldn't have named it. But she felt it the way you feel a change in the weather before the sky shows it. Something in the quality of the silence between Karen and Laura. Something in the way they weren't quite looking at her. Something in the fact that they had been walking for quite a while now, and nobody had suggested turning back. She began to slow her steps. She began to look around. And then, according to the testimony of the only witness who would eventually come forward, what happened next happened very quickly. To understand what happened in those woods, you have to understand who Melissa Carter really was. Not just the headline version, the pretty girl, the popular girl, the victim. You have to understand the actual human being, because when you do, the tragedy of what was done to her becomes almost impossible to sit with. Melissa grew up in a working-class family in the San Fernando Valley. Her father worked long hours. Her mother was the kind of woman who made every birthday feel like an event and every problem feel like something that could be solved. Melissa was the middle child, older brother, younger brother, and she occupied that middle child space with a kind of easy grace that people who knew her still talk about. She wasn't a pushover, but she wasn't combative. She had strong opinions, but she delivered them gently. She was, by every single account, a genuinely good person. Not perfect, no one is, but good in the specific way that means you make the people around you feel seen and valued. She loved music. She kept a journal that was apparently filled with song lyrics, thoughts about her future, sketches of outfits she wanted to design. She had told her mother that she wanted to go to fashion school after graduating. She had a whole version of her adult life mapped out in her head, a city apartment, a job she loved, travel, eventually a family of her own. She was the kind of teenager who actually believed the future was going to be good, and that belief was infectious. People around Melissa tended to feel a little more hopeful about things than they did before they spent time with her. Karen Mitchell was a different kind of person, and I want to be fair here, because Karen was not born bad. Nobody is born bad. Karen grew up in a home that was, by several accounts, more chaotic than Melissa's, a difficult divorce, a father who was largely absent, a mother who worked constantly and was often exhausted. Karen was smart, but she struggled to translate that intelligence into the kind of easy social confidence that came naturally to Melissa. She was funny in a sharp, slightly uncomfortable way, the kind of funny that gets laughs but also sometimes makes people shift in their seats. She had a temper that she worked hard to keep hidden, a simmering quality that occasionally surfaced and then disappeared so quickly that people sometimes wondered if they had imagined it. What Karen wanted, more than almost anything, was to be the most important person in whatever room she was in. That need, which was really a kind of hunger for the validation she hadn't received at home, drove most of her social behavior. And for a while, her friendship with Melissa actually served that need reasonably well. Being close to Melissa meant proximity to warmth, to popularity, to inclusion. Karen could borrow Melissa's social light, so to speak, and for years, that arrangement worked for both of them. But as they got older, and as the gap between where Melissa was going and where Karen felt stuck became wider and harder to ignore, that borrowed warmth started to feel like something else. It started to feel like a reminder of everything Karen was not. And that is when the friendship, quietly and invisibly, began to curdle. By their junior year of high school, people who knew both girls have said, looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, that there were small, easy-to-miss signs that Karen's feelings toward Melissa had changed. She occasionally said something slightly cutting about Melissa's appearance or her choices, quickly framing it as a joke. She sometimes excluded Melissa from conversations that were happening right in front of her, casually redirecting attention in ways that were subtle enough to be deniable. She had begun to talk about Melissa differently to other people, not viciously, not openly, but with a faint undercurrent of dismissal that planted small seeds of doubt. These are the behaviors, as investigators and psychologists would later observe, of someone engaged in a slow, deliberate process of repositioning, quietly rearranging the social furniture so that when something happened, the pieces would already be in place. And Laura was angrier and less controlled. Her resentment over the situation with Victor was rawer, more immediate. She was the kind of person who felt her emotions at full volume and found it difficult to manage them quietly. She and Karen had formed an alliance that was, in retrospect, almost inevitable, two people carrying grievances that, separately, might have faded over time, but together kept each other alive and growing. They fed each other's resentment. They validated each other's worst interpretations of Melissa's behavior. They constructed, between the two of them, A version of Melissa Carter that was almost entirely fictional, a version that was manipulative, dishonest, and deserving of punishment. And having constructed that version, they began to act on it. What happened on the trail that afternoon was the result of planning. That is one of the hardest things to accept about this case. Not that it was a moment of rage, not that it was an impulse that ran away from its owners, but that it was thought through. That two girls who had known Melissa for years looked at her and decided, deliberately, that she should not go home that day. According to the testimony that eventually came forward, and according to the physical evidence at the scene, here is what investigators believe happened. At some point along the trail, the conversation became a confrontation. Melissa was accused, loudly, aggressively, of things she either hadn't done or that had been so distorted by the telling that they were unrecognizable. She tried to defend herself. She was confused by the anger directed at her. She couldn't understand where it was coming from or why it was so intense. And then, in the way that confrontations sometimes do, the situation escalated beyond the point where words were the only weapon being used. Melissa was small. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. Karen was bigger. Laura was bigger. What happened in that creek, and I am going to be measured in how I describe this, because I want to tell you what the evidence shows without gratuitous detail, was not an accident, and it was not equal. It was 2 against 1, on a trail far from any road, with a girl who trusted the people who were hurting her right up until the moment she understood that trust had been a catastrophic mistake. Afterward, they placed a log on top of her. They cut her hair. These acts were not incidental. They were deliberate, and investigators have always read them as a kind of statement, an act of final contempt, performed on a girl who could no longer defend herself. Then Karen and Laura walked back down the trail, got back into the car, and drove away. And when they got back to the neighborhood, Karen Mitchell did something that, even now, is almost impossible to comprehend. She went to Melissa's house. She knocked on the door, and when Melissa's mother answered, Karen looked her in the face and told her she didn't know where Melissa was. 3 days passed before Melissa's body was found. 3 days during which her family called every friend they could think of, contacted the school, drove slowly through the neighborhood calling her name. 3 days during which Karen Mitchell was present at the house on multiple occasions, crying, helping coordinate the search, comforting Melissa's mother with a hand on her arm and words of reassurance that everything was going to be okay, that Melissa was probably fine, that she was probably just staying with someone and hadn't found a way to call yet. The discovery of the body on October 4th changed everything and nothing simultaneously. It changed everything because now the family knew the worst. It changed nothing because the investigation that followed was, for the better part of 3 years, unable to produce the truth. The initial working theory focused on 3 boys in a blue car, a detail introduced into the investigation by Laura Simmons herself, who told detectives a carefully constructed story about dropping Melissa off with 3 strangers she had never seen before. Detectives pursued this lead diligently and found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The blue car did not exist. The 3 boys did not exist. They were a fiction invented on the drive back from the woods, designed to send investigators in exactly the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Karen Mitchell's involvement in the search efforts continued. She attended Melissa's memorial service. She sat with the family. She helped go through Melissa's belongings. There are photographs from that period, photographs that are genuinely hard to look at once you know what you know, of Karen standing with Melissa's mother at the memorial, her arm around the woman's shoulders. The photographs look like a grieving friend. They are something else entirely. For 3 years, the case went nowhere. Detectives had a body, a crime scene, and a ghost story about 3 unknown boys in a car. Melissa's family had an open wound that would not close. And Karen and Laura went on with their lives. Karen, in fact, went further than simply going on. She moved in with the Avila family for a period of time, living in the house of the girl she had killed, sleeping under the same roof as the mother she had left without a daughter. Whether this was a calculated move to monitor the investigation or a psychological compulsion of a different and perhaps darker kind, is something that has never been fully settled. But she was there. She was there for months. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. A young woman named Diane Torres had been present at a gathering where, allegedly, Karen Mitchell had made statements about what had happened on the trail not a full confession, but enough. Enough inconsistency. Enough implication. Diane had stayed silent for a long time, for reasons that are perhaps understandable and perhaps less so. But 3 years is a long time to carry something like that. And eventually, she called the police. Detectives reopened the case. They brought Karen and Laura in for questioning, separately and carefully. And what emerged from those interrogations, over the course of days, was the architecture of a lie that had been constructed with remarkable patience and remarkable coldness, and that, like all constructions built on unstable ground, could not hold its shape once the right pressure was applied. Laura Simmons broke first. That is, in broad terms, what investigators described afterward. Under sustained questioning, with detectives presenting her, carefully, methodically, with the inconsistencies between her original account and the physical evidence, and with the implication that they already knew more than she might assume, Laura's story began to fracture. Small cracks at first. A date that didn't line up. A detail that contradicted something she had said 3 years earlier. And then, in the way that fractured things sometimes do, it gave way all at once. Laura told investigators what had happened on that trail. She described the confrontation, the escalation, and the act itself. She described Karen as the primary force behind both the planning and the execution. She described her own role with the particular mixture of minimization and horror that characterizes testimony given by someone who is simultaneously trying to reduce their culpability and coming to terms, perhaps for the first time in a sustained way, with what they actually did. Karen Mitchell, when confronted, did not go quietly. She challenged the investigation. She challenged Laura's account. She had, by that point, spent 3 years maintaining a version of reality in which she was a grieving friend, and she did not abandon that version easily. But the evidence had accumulated in ways she could not fully account for, and eventually, the weight of it was too great. She was charged. Both women were charged. The trial, when it came, was a community event in the truest and most painful sense. People who had grown up in that neighborhood, who had known both the victim and the perpetrator since childhood, sat in that courtroom and tried to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person being described by the evidence. Melissa's mother, Irene Carter, was present for the proceedings. She sat in that courtroom and listened to the details of what had been done to her daughter, and she sat in that same courtroom and looked at the woman who had stood in her kitchen crying and comforting her after having done those things. The testimony that day about what had been done, the physical details, the cold deliberateness of the aftermath, reduced multiple people in that courtroom to tears, including, according to witnesses, some of the detectives who had worked the case. Karen Mitchell and Laura Simmons were both convicted of second-degree murder. They were each sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The jury deliberated for a relatively short time. The evidence, by the end, was not ambiguous. Here is the thing about this story that doesn't end with the verdict. Here is the part that stays with you. Karen Mitchell served her sentence and was eventually granted parole. She was released. She changed her name. And then, years after her release, under that new name, she published a book. A book about her experiences. A book that, according to Melissa's family, contained false statements about Melissa herself, about the girl who was murdered, about the family that had lost her, rewritten in ways that served Karen's own narrative. Melissa's family pursued legal action to stop the profits from that book from reaching Karen. They fought to ensure that the woman who had killed their daughter could not now profit from the retelling of that story in a version where she was something other than what she was. That legal battle, in many ways, is its own story. It is a story about what happens when the justice system hands down a sentence and then, over time, returns someone to the world who still cannot or will not fully account for what they have done. It raises questions that do not have clean answers. Questions about rehabilitation, about accountability, about what it means to tell the truth about yourself when the truth is something this dark, about whether someone who spent 3 years living in the house of the girl she killed, comforting the mother, sleeping in the rooms, breathing the air of the life she had taken, can ever be trusted to tell an honest story about who she is. Melissa Carter's mother spent the rest of her life advocating for victims' rights legislation in California. The case contributed, according to legal historians and advocacy groups, to the development of new laws around victims' rights and the rights of families in criminal proceedings. Melissa did not get to live her life. But the way her story moved through the world changed things for other people who were navigating similar darkness. That is not a comfortable consolation. It is not the kind of ending anyone would choose. But it is real, and it matters. Laura Simmons also served time and was eventually released. Unlike Karen, she has, by most accounts, maintained a lower profile. Whether that represents genuine remorse or simply a different kind of self-preservation is something no one outside her own mind can know. What I keep coming back to, in thinking about this case, is Melissa herself. The girl who got into that car in good faith. The girl who laughed on the drive up into the hills. The girl who felt, at some point on that trail, that something was wrong, and who, by the time she understood exactly how wrong it was, had no way to change it. The girl whose diary is still somewhere, whose sketches of future outfits still exist somewhere, who had plans for a city apartment and a job she loved and a life that was supposed to go on for decades. That girl deserves to be the center of this story, even though, and this is the brutal irony of true crime as a genre, it is the darkness that surrounds her that most people will remember. I want you to remember her differently. I want you to remember the laugh that could fill a room. I want you to remember the warmth. Because that is what was taken. Not just a life in the abstract, a particular, irreplaceable warmth that the world needed and now does not have. And the final question I want to leave you with is this. Not, who did it? We know who did it. Not, was justice served? There is a case for arguing it was, and a case for arguing it wasn't. And I think both cases deserve your honest consideration. The question I want to leave you with is this. How many Melissas are there, right now, who trust someone they shouldn't? How many people are walking through their lives completely unaware that the person they call their best friend is carrying something corrosive and directed at them? We cannot answer that question, but we can pay attention. We can take seriously the small moments of discomfort, the slightly cutting joke, the redirection of attention, the patterns that individually mean nothing but together mean something. We can believe people when they act like they want to hurt us, even when everything else about them looks like love. Because sometimes, it turns out, those two things were never as far apart as we assumed. Now, before we close out today, I want to hear from you, and I mean that genuinely, not as a formality, but because the questions this case raises are the kind that land differently depending on where you sit, where you grew up, what your own experiences with friendship and betrayal have been. So, I want you to go down to the comments right now and tell me this. When you look back at the warning signs in this story, the cutting remarks, the slow repositioning, the way Karen stayed close to Melissa's family after the murder, what point do you think you would have seen it? Not when did the investigators see it. Not when did the witnesses finally come forward. You, personally, watching this from the outside. At what point would something have shifted for you? I find that question genuinely interesting because the honest answer for most people is later than we would like to admit, and I think that honesty is valuable. I also want you to think about this. Karen Mitchell moved into Melissa Carter's home after the murder. She lived there. She comforted the mother. She attended the memorial. For 3 years, she maintained a performance of grief so convincing that it fooled everyone around her. That requires something. I don't know exactly what to call it, but it requires something that most people don't have, a capacity to compartmentalize, to separate action from feeling, to exist in two realities simultaneously for an extended period of time. And I want to ask you, do you think you would have noticed? The small tells, the slightly off moments, the things that in retrospect look so obvious, but in the moment look like nothing? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely read them. These conversations are part of why we make these videos. And if this story left you thinking about how we trust people, how we read people, how we miss the things right in front of us, then you are going to want to stay close to this channel, because the next story we are covering goes even deeper into that territory. It involves a woman who, for over a decade, managed to maintain two entirely separate lives, two families, two identities, two sets of people who loved her completely and knew nothing about the other half of her existence. And the way it all came apart is something that, once you hear it, you will not be able to stop thinking about. The details are extraordinary, and we are going to walk through every one of them. That video is coming very soon, and you do not want to miss it. If you are watching this and you are not yet subscribed, take 10 seconds right now and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing. It means you will be here for the next story, and the one after that, and all the stories we have coming that are waiting to be told. Every one of them is real. Every one of them is worth your time. And every one of them, I promise you, will leave you thinking differently about the world you move through every day. Melissa Carter was 17 years old. She had a laugh that could fill up a whole room. She trusted the wrong person, and she paid the price that none of us should ever have to pay for trusting someone we love. Her story deserves to be told, and now you know it. Thank you for being here with me today. We will see you in the next one.